If my keyboard is picked up while I'm doing this, then so be it, because today we're going to be talking about Waifu Wars. If you already know this channel and you already know that this actually used to be a debate channel, obviously the channel has gone through major changes because obviously I decided I want to actually do something different with my time, aside from simply just sit here and talk about who's the better debater and why I specifically dislike some debaters. So with that being said, I'm just going to be talking about Waifu Wars and rezero. And if you don't know what Waifu Wars are, especially in context of rezero, it's quite simple. It isn't a particularly difficult concept to grasp. Waifu Wars and rezero essentially just are people arguing consistently. Also, that's Haramspongebob, but people arguing consistently about who they think is the better romantic partner for Subaru. And they continue arguing to ridiculous extents about it, to such an extent that they either portray the other person right within the series. For example, Rem fans will portray Emilia in a dishonest manner, and Emilia fans will portray Rem in a dishonest manner, such that they actually can convince other people, convince the general populace, that one of them is just a better romantic partner than the other for Subaru. Or even if they don't do this, they'll also just try and say that one of them, even if they are a good partner for Subaru, simply just aren't very well written. Therefore, you should prefer Emilia over Rem, or prefer Rem over Emilia. And most of the discourse about it is just extremely dishonest. And it's dishonest for like a bunch of reasons, mainly because these people actually just aren't particularly interested in actually engaging in good faith whenever they're speaking about these things. For example, you see people like Emilia fans consistently speak about things like how, oh my goodness, Rem killed Subaru. If Rem killed Subaru, how can you possibly think she's a good character? How can you possibly think she's a good romantic option? But like, if you ask them whether or not they think Garfield and Otto are good friends to Subaru, and then they would probably say yes, but yet Garfield has killed far more people than Rem has in his entire lifetime. We see he like kills multiple people in failed loops, right? Otto literally shoves Subaru off of the dragon carriage. Now, obviously, there's like context as to why both of them did these things, but in the same way, there's also context as to why Rem did these things, right? Context which Subaru himself understands and acknowledges and has personally moved past. So for you to actually make sort of claims that, oh my goodness, you can move past it when Garfield does it, but you can't move past it when Rem does it, just shows that you don't particularly care about the morality of the issue, because Garfield kills way more people than Rem does. Otto also killed Subaru, right? So like, there's no real avenue to like actually get out of that sort of dilemma without making yourself look like a hypocrite. But it's fine generally. But also the same sort of dishonest discourse also applies to like Emilia for like Rem fans with Emilia, where they try and actually portray Emilia as some dumb idiot who is actually incapable of understanding romance, when in reality that isn't particularly true. Whereas Emilia's actual feelings towards romance are far more complicated because of the fact that she's been sheltered her entire life, and she isn't really capable at the moment, or well, she isn't really capable for a good portion of the series of actually distinguishing things like familial or platonic love and romantic love. That doesn't particularly matter because that has like no bearing on whether or not she actually is a good romantic partner for one. Because like, usually whenever people talk about being a good romantic partner, we're usually talking about how like, oh my god, you actually care for the other person, like you are capable of actually helping them in a manner which people who actually have platonic relationships with somebody else are incapable of doing. And yet whenever people say that Emilia is just too stupid to be a good romantic partner, it ignores the fact that even though she isn't academically intelligent, she actually is extremely emotionally intelligent. She's extremely emotionally intelligent to such a level that even other royal candidates are actually forced to acknowledge this. Priscilla herself actually directly acknowledges Emilia as an opponent because of the fact that Emilia is consistently evolving into somebody who is worthy of being considered a good leader. Yet, regardless of that, people seem to continue to hone in on the fact that Emilia isn't really academically intelligent whenever they're trying to talk about whether or not she's a good relationship partner with Subaru. Now, maybe you can actually pull up the academic intelligence point as a point as to why she's a bad leader, and I personally have my own reservations as to what's calling Emilia a good leader for the Emilia camp. But like, her own academic intelligence doesn't particularly matter towards whether or not she's a good romantic partner for Subaru. And it's this sort of dishonesty which people use whenever they are arguing that actually leads to a majority of the good waifu or discourse specifically. And actually, the standards of relationship in general are also part of what contributes to this sort of dishonest discourse, where people are essentially wasting their time because they're talking past each other, because of the fact that people actually have entirely arbitrary expectations of what exactly they think a good relationship is, or what exactly they think a good relationship partner is. For example, some people actually have this like weird convoluted idea where they have in their head that, oh my goodness, if Rem and Subaru's relationship has some parts of it which are not exactly ideal, therefore the entire relationship is bad as a whole, the entire relationship is flawed, therefore like they should not actually get together due to these flaws. And in the same way, people will already like continuously try to enforce these sorts of arbitrary standards when you need to essentially fill some like set criteria which is never actually hinted at within the series to determine whether or not the relationship is good, right? And then try and apply it onto the characters, which obviously doesn't make sense. People have this weird like addiction to committing composition fallacies where they consistently try and point out the fact that like, oh my goodness, well, Emilia is actually part accidentally of the reasons why Subaru is suffering, and she's part accidentally of the reasons because if Subaru didn't love her, then he wouldn't be suffering like this. And while that is true, that isn't the entire reason why he's suffering. And trying to like frame it as though Emilia is like the entire reason why Subaru is suffering is also the same as trying to frame it as, oh my goodness, well, these Rem fans, or sorry, like, oh my goodness, well, Rem and Subaru have like this toxic moment, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to hyper focus on this moment where both of them didn't act in an ideal manner, right? And then use that to discredit your entire relationship. But in the same way, can you not also do the same thing to like Subaru and Emilia's relationship? You can say Subaru was extremely toxic in Arc 2 to 3, therefore you can't really forgive Subaru as a relationship partner for Emilia, therefore like Subaru shouldn't get with Emilia because, oh my goodness, look at this, their toxic past. And it's like, it doesn't really make sense when you actually start asking these sorts of questions and you actually start like trying to apply the sort of standards that these people who actually try and purport these standards use consistently, right? You will notice that immediately it's backpedaling, oh my goodness, there's more context, when in reality there just is actually no greater context. You will also realize that whenever you like actually try and argue with these people who hold these sorts of beliefs on these waifu wars, that they have this like stinging like addiction to not answering yes or no questions. And like, while obviously yes or no questions are not the only format which you should answer questions in, right, it is important to note that most, if not like a lot of questions, right, are actually dichotomous in nature, where a true or false answer would let everyone know exactly what you think without any need for actual prevarication or obfuscation. Yet the reason why people are actually incapable and don't want to answer these sorts of questions in a yes or no format is specifically because they have an answer, they have an opinion that they know will actually make them look bad, and they don't have evidence for it. And like, there's a few examples of this that I actually have written down. Right? For example, people primarily see things like the sloth thief. They see the sloth thief not as some avenue to actually explore Subaru's character development, in given that he's in different circumstances, explore how Subaru is becoming a new father, right? A father which is an entirely foreign experience for him, exploring how Subaru and Rem's relationship has developed as characters, considering they are like very blatant narrative parallels. But instead of doing that, what most people actually opt to do is instead try and use this as like some got you moment, and try and use this as some like avenue, right, to try and say that, oh my goodness, look guys, like Rem and Subaru getting together is actually representative of a bad end, and representative of a bad end because it's in an ifra. However, if all bad ends were actually ifrats, or sorry, if every single ifra was a bad end, then you would also have to concede that Emilia and Subaru is also a bad end, specifically because of the fact that Emilia and Subaru are stated by the author to actually be going to have their own dedicated ifrat soon later on within the series. So the fact is that when you try and apply these people's standards consistently, you will notice that like, they immediately runs into contradictions, because these people don't even believe the sort of things which are coming out of their mouth whenever they're actually proposing with different sorts of evidence. People also try and use the points that Subaru allegedly goes back to the very beginning. Immediately he uses return by death as some form of point to actually show that, oh my goodness, Subaru cannot be satisfied, right, if he's with Rem alone, ignoring the fact that not only is Subaru with Rem alone, there's also far more context than that, such as all of Subaru's friends dying. So it isn't really ideal, or it isn't really some description which shows that Subaru cannot be satisfied with Rem as a partner, but more so Subaru cannot be satisfied with Rem as a partner, granted that all of his friends are dead, and granted that he is abandoned and betrayed himself. But even then, the statement which actually says that Subaru, like, quote unquote, returned back to Arc 3 just doesn't even exist. These specific people who actually try and argue that, like, oh my god, Subaru resets back to Arc 3, they, whenever you see them make these YouTube videos, whenever you see them actually make these talking points, or actually try and like say these talking points, they don't actually have evidence. right? And this is something that like people need to hop more on about. That whenever you see people actually like people like Bonnie Slayer who keep saying that polygamous relationships would make rezero harem slop, or you see people saying that Subaru actually resets back to arc 3, when you actually ask them if they have evidence for it, the answer will be no, or it will be some vague answer like it's obvious, when in reality saying that something is obvious is simply just you appealing to your own personal intuitions and talking about what you personally believe is actually believable, rather than actually talking about what is factually stated within the series. Now obviously there's room for inference about like specific parts, but what isn't a valid inference is if there's a statement, which there is, saying that Subaru does not use return by death after the timeline divergence which occurred in arc 3, right? And then saying that, oh my god, well no, it doesn't mean he doesn't use return by death, which is what is literally stated. Instead it means some other interpretation which actually involves a whole new sentence which is not what was stated. And it's like there's a difference between like actually interpreting media and then just completely rewriting it for your own personal purposes, right? Especially considering that interpretations of media will not suddenly say or change the entire sentence structure and then phrase it as an interpretation unless there's corroborating evidence. But there is no corroborating evidence, and it's rather just the personal intuitions on whether or what is exactly Subaru would or would not be satisfied with. But moving on to Emilia discourse, you see people having like lots of conversations about how, oh my goodness, Emilia doesn't know what a divine general is, and oh my goodness, Emilia is just the cause of all of Subaru's suffering, and she doesn't even acknowledge that she's in love with him. Oh my goodness. And it's like that's like obviously not true. If like if Emilia didn't recognize that she was in love with Subaru, she wouldn't have said she was in love with Subaru. She wouldn't have actually like made bold claims to somebody like Cecilas, right, and be like, no, there's already somebody who I've decided to fall in love with, so I can't actually fall in love with you. She wouldn't have actually like gone against Regulus in the manner that she did. She wouldn't have done all of these things if she just wasn't in love with Subaru, but didn't understand that she was in love with Subaru all the way. Now you may say that her not being in love or her not understanding her feelings might be frustrating, but it's also sort of unrealistic to expect these sorts of things from Emilia. Now obviously I agree that Emilia as a leader, right, you should expect great things from her regardless of the circumstances, in my opinion, right, because as they say, anything worth doing is worth doing well, and the world only cares about results, right? So even if regardless of the sort of in-series explanations which they have for Emilia actually not knowing nearly as much as she should, right? Regardless of these sort of in-series explanations, there is an obligation which she has to know more, right? And it's fine to actually say that Emilia should know more. However, whenever it comes to her actually being a viable like candidate or a viable romantic option for Subaru, right, that is entirely irrelevant to her own leadership capability. So whenever people try and conflate the two, it just seems extremely odd, because it's kind of like mistaking apples for oranges, because those two things don't correlate. There's no actual connection between her knowing a lot about the kingdom or knowing a lot about the world and also being a good romantic partner for Subaru. In the same way how if you had a wife who was French, who doesn't really know anything about countries outside of France, you wouldn't say that she's a bad romantic partner for you just because she doesn't know anything about countries outside of France, right? Because that isn't what you're looking for in a relationship. Nobody's looking in a relationship for somebody to actually do a geography test. Now again, I am not going to say that you shouldn't criticize her for not knowing as a leader, but you shouldn't criticize her on the basis of being a romantic option for these sorts of reasons. On top of that fact, whenever people say that Emilia has never actually done anything for Subaru, right, that's like obviously blatantly false. Like we see this consistently in arc like 3, we see this in arc we see this in arc 3, we see this in arc 2, we see this in arc 4, we see this in arc 5, right? We see this continuously where like Emilia is constantly sticking her neck out for Subaru, literally putting her entire life on the line against Sirius just because Subaru said so. She attacks Sirius because she trusts Subaru so much. She trusts him and believes that the things Subaru said will inevitably guide her to victory. She is constantly doing things for Subaru that Subaru couldn't do by himself. Whenever Subaru is crashing out in the forest, right, because he couldn't actually figure out a way to beat Roswell before Otto came in, it was Emilia who actually caused him to calm himself down, right? Whenever Subaru was having a mental breakdown because obviously he is so terrified trying to put on a front in front of Ram, right, it is Emilia who actually tells him that it's fine for him to actually let out his emotions. And even though Subaru isn't particularly comfortable with letting out his emotions in front of like Emilia and stuff, right? That doesn't mean that she isn't doing things for him, because Emilia and Rem represent two different sides of the same coin, both of whom that Subaru actually loves romantically. Where in Emilia's case, Subaru wants to look his best, Subaru wants to look cool, and in Rem's case, Subaru actually looks to her as motivation towards looking cool for other people. He looks to her for somebody who he can actually display his weakness to, rather than constantly needing to be strong, which is actually what is expected of him within the main ReZero world. And for some reason, people seem to not be capable of understanding this sort of parallel, or even when they do actually try and understand this sort of parallel, they then proceed to try and downgrade either of these characters by saying things like, oh my goodness, neither of these characters have writing outside of like Subaru, when in reality that isn't true either. Like, again, Rem's entire identity and Rem's entire like purpose within the narrative is to serve as a narrative mirror to Subaru. She has similar goals to Subaru, which are also different, where her goals are not only to support Subaru as a person because she's in love with him, but also discover her own identity, carve out her own identity, because of the fact that her own identity has consistently been suppressed by the existence of her sister. And in Emilia's case, her goal is like quite straightforward. She wants to be the king, she wants to be the queen, she wants to be the person who actually like who actually ends discrimination within Lugunica, right? She wants to do all of these things which are entirely independent of Subaru. However, Subaru is necessary for those goals to be accomplished. In the same way, Subaru is also necessary for Rem's goal of actually carving out her own identity to be accomplished, because she needs Subaru's own outside perspective on her, right, to actually give her the motivation and the belief that she is actually capable of carving out her own identity. And people choosing to willingly ignore this just sort of shows a wider issue, where people are most convinced and actually fine with calling other people lops without actually choosing to actually think about the sort of stuff they're saying. Most of the people who you see on the internet who actually call you a lop about things relating to Emilia and Rem, most of the time they themselves haven't actually read the novels, and if they have read the novels, they don't understand nearly as much about the novels as they actually do. So, like, obviously, these people just are, like, blatantly being dishonest in their rhetoric. And it's sort of odd why they would even choose to be dishonest in these sort of, like, environments. But obviously, people have their own personal biases towards these characters. So, like, I don't want to say that I don't fully understand why they do it. But more so, it's just, like, I think that would be preferable if they stopped, because most of the time these people actually have this weird notion, which is Emilia and Rem fans both, that oh my goodness, the series would be significantly worse, right, if Emilia did not get with Subaru at the end, or if Rem didn't get to Subaru at the end, ignoring the fact that ReZero is so much more than its romance, I should say. ReZero is so much more than simply who Subaru will get with, who Subaru will marry. There's so much more to ReZero. So when people try and actually downgrade ReZero as a series, try and downgrade it as like a franchise and as a brand, right, obviously it just does the series an injustice. I've seen people say, oh my god, I'm going to drop the series if Subaru doesn't get with Emilia at the end. And it's like, what? Is that like the only thing? Or is that like one of the really the main things which you enjoy about the series? Like, are we really being serious? And the answer is like, obviously no. I just can't fathom the idea of somebody genuinely like enjoying the concept of Rem and Subaru getting together, or Emilia and Subaru getting together, far more than Emilia and Subaru's own character development, far more than Rem's own character development, far more than understanding the secrets of the series which have actually been hidden from us for a very good portion of it that we have yet to discover, right? And all of these things which we have yet to discover take far more precedence within the narrative than Subaru and Rem's or Subaru and Emilia's romance. So when people actually try and say that, oh my goodness, the series would be significantly worse if this romance or if their romantic dreams didn't actually become fulfilled, it just shows to me that, in my opinion, you're just not really enjoying the ReZero for the actual series, but it's more so that a sunk cost fallacy has actually gone on, where you're actually just too invested and too deep into the romance that now you just can't drop the series, right? And because you can't drop the series, there's only one thing you're hoping for, and that's Subaru to marry one person. And it's like, that's so odd. You also see these sort of other brand of people who say that like a polygamous ending would be sort of slop, right? And like, usually, if not all of the time, like you can look on Reddit, you can look at like on Twitter, most of the time, these people will just say, oh my god, it's disrespectful to the women. But like, why? Like, why would it be disrespectful to them? Like, why would it be bad? Like most of these people who are making these claims about polygamous relationships, it's not as if they have any study that's backing it up that says, oh my god, polygamous relationships per capita, right? Well, not per capita, but like as proportion to the sort of population which they have, these polygamous relationships are obviously extremely negative compared to monogamous ones, for one. And then there's also no precedent for that actually existing or being true within rezero. So whenever people say that these polygamous relationships will be slow, it's sort of odd, because whenever I think that a harem like show or series is bad, it's usually because of the fact that the main character seems to just be collecting wives as sort of trophies, who actually don't really have much character to them externally to the main character and externally to specifically loving the main character, which obviously isn't true for somebody like Rem and Emilia. So whenever people actually disagree with like polygamous relationships in general, or they say they hate the harem genre, right, I really understand what they mean. I just don't understand why that specifically applies to rezero in general, right? Because there's no reason to actually believe that these people actually fit any of the harem stereotypes, aside from Subaru and Rem also getting together alongside Subaru getting together with Emilia. And then I know there's obviously the other rebuttal that, oh my goodness, well, if Emilia chose to get with another guy, would you be fine with that? And it's like, well, obviously I wouldn't be fine with that. And the reason why I wouldn't be fine with that is because there's no sort of narrative build-up that's actually been portrayed that leads towards it. If Subaru randomly fell in love with somebody, right, at the very end of the series who just immediately replaced Emilia and Rem, obviously I'd be against that. If Subaru got into a polygamous relationship with Emilia and Rem, and then suddenly he fell in love with the third woman, and this third woman has just come out of absolutely nowhere, there's no sort of real connection between the two, he's just fallen in love with her randomly, right? Obviously I'd be against that, because the narrative has not built that up. The narrative has not sold me the idea that these two people actually are people who I should root towards getting together, right? But that obviously just isn't the case for like Subaru's relationship with Emilia and Rem, right? Most of these content creators who make these sort of takes, you will notice that they will make the takes but not really give any form of justification. But yeah, with that being said, if you like these sorts of videos, please remember to like and subscribe. I'm obviously shifting my content from like sort of rant content about debating to rant content about rezero. So if you like this sort of change, then please tell me what else I can improve. This has been Shinra or Hercules, and I'm out. Have a nice day.